Sensitive Withdrawn.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, right. So you should probably do like some sort of semi-official introduction.
Starting thing.
So yeah, why don't you just start by saying a little bit about who you are and how you work and what you do.
Great. Are we on?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I'm Sylvie. My name's Sylvie, and I am a recent graduate from Naropa. So I come from a background of contemplative, mindfulness-based, transpersonal psychotherapy, which is a mouthful.
Mm-hmm.
And I do Hakomi, which is mindfulness-based somatic therapy, which is also a mouthful. But what it comes down to is just that I feel really strongly about working with people from a strengths-based perspective.
Yeah.
And working in a way that includes all of the parts of being human, which to me means body, heart, mind, spirit.
Yeah. And so we were just looking at your website a minute ago, and you actually specialize in working with sexual trauma too?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that though that's how I label the specialty, what I could also say is I feel really passionate about supporting women to feel safe and comfortable in their bodies.
Yes.
And to explore the blocks that keep them from feeling that way, whether it be trauma or sexual trauma, or even body image, eating disorder, sort of trauma of being a woman in society.
Yeah. And do you work with couples or just individuals?
I will be working with couples later this year, but I'm just working with individuals right now.
Cool. Very cool. So, I've done just a brief intro to what character structures are in Hakomi, but I haven't really gone into the sensitive withdrawn character type at all. And so before we kind of get into the specifics and the subtleties and nuances, can you just sort of briefly describe like what it is?
Yeah. Well, first I think I would say that for me, understanding my character, and particularly this one, has been really helpful in my understanding of how I'm different from people around me, but also how I'm similar to people around me.
Yeah, sure.
It's given me sort of the understanding that the way that I approach the world and view the world isn't the only way, which I know sounds simple, but
people
it's really hard to know. And it's helped me immensely both to know myself, but also in my relationships with others, because I find myself not making the assumptions that I make about someone else seeing the world the same way that I do.
Yeah, it's funny, I've always kind of thought of that in the term of being a little bit arrogant, like how we're all a little bit arrogant in that way of like, oh, this is the way that my mind and body works, and we all must be similar.
Totally.
Right? And so getting that reality check of, oh, there are people who are vastly differently organized than I am. Holy cow. Like that's kind of a mind blown, so it's true.
And it also gives me permission to really take care of myself and set my life up in a way that I'm supporting my character. Like bringing the things into my life that help me to feel good, but also to overcome some of my limitations, and not putting myself in situations that, all my friends are doing, even though I don't want to, or even though it's not right for me.
So kind of knowing a little bit more about how you're developed, what your character type is, actually helps you take care of yourself better.
Yeah.
Right? Not putting yourself in situations that you know are going to be weird or threatening or kind of put you off in some way. Yeah.
Or doing that, but doing it intentionally.
Right. Knowing that you're doing this. Right. That you might accept the consequences of it actually, going south on you.
Right.
Yeah. It's funny because I remember when we first became friends, I was very surprised at like how much you actually do. You were very busy with social engagements and doing this and that and the other thing, and you would get so exhausted by it. And I even like remember telling you a couple times, like, why do you do so much? Like, go home and take a nap or something, you know?
Well, that's a great example of two character structures inside of me competing for attention too.
Yeah,
which is maybe a little more complex than we want to go into, but the one that I want to talk about is called Sensitive Withdrawn, and I'll say more about that, but you could sort of snapshot that as being someone who really needs a lot of quiet and space and alone time.
Yeah.
And the other character that I have is Industrious, which is someone who really needs to feel like they are earning their worth in the world, both in the world and in their relationships. So it's like friends all the time and commitments and achievements, and so
crossing things off a list in order to like feel like you're being productive and helpful or successful.
Yeah. So those two pieces in me
very competing.
Have very different needs.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And which one would you say, if you could, is more powerful? Which one do you rely on more?
That's a really good question. I think in a functional way, I rely on the industriousness because it helps me to survive in the world. But in a deep emotional, spiritual way, I'm ruled by Sensitive Withdrawn.
Right. So it's kind of different contexts of how you go about it.
Yeah. And you could see it like, I kind of see it as, those Russian dolls. Yeah. The Industrious one is kind of one of the outside dolls. It's something I learned a little later in life.
Image. Yeah.
It was like, probably like early elementary school age that started to kick in for me.
Yeah.
And Sensitive Withdrawn is like in utero, like before I was even born. I think it was impacting me. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a good segue actually. Yeah. So in terms of Sensitive Withdrawn, like, how is it formed? When is it formed?
Great question. So Sensitive Withdrawn is one of the earliest character formations, and
so like in utero.
It's about in utero to about, I think it's 6 months of life is sort of the approximate time frame.
Super early.
Super early, and the basic core question of that character stage is the world safe?
Right.
So, and this is Hakomi, but it also correlates to developmental models of psychology. Yeah. So, so the core question is I'm safe? Is I'm safe? Am I safe? Is the world safe? And am I okay? Like, am I welcomed into the world? And so I think you see this character come up for people who have really obvious early childhood trauma, like they weren't wanted, their parents were addicts, they, for whatever reason, were neglected in their early
in that
youth.
Very formative stage.
Right, and it could, it could be that obvious. It could just be like they weren't safe.
Right.
But it also could be, it could come from a deeper emotional place. And our teacher, Melissa Grace, talks about this beautifully. She talks about how characters kind of our natural sort of temperament meeting our environment. So character could come from an environment that isn't safe, or it could come from a temperament that's really sensitive and really easily overwhelmed by the world, and doesn't feel like they have help managing their fear or their emotions or their sadness. So there are a lot of different ways that people come across this character structure.
Sure. So there's a lot of different variables at play there. There's like nature-nurture things for sure. And if you do kind of have a little bit more of this innate sensitivity or something like that, and you do come across this kind of trauma or encountering this unsafe world, it can make it a lot worse.
Yeah, and what I would say, to use myself as an example, is that I actually was really privileged. I had a very loving family and a very safe environment to grow up in. But my mother was really anxious for my safety. And she talks about being pregnant with me and hearing like gunshots on our street. We were living in, I wasn't born, but we were living in Philadelphia at the time. And I think that level of anxiety and sort of heightened nervous system that she had throughout her pregnancy, and then when I was a little kid, really taught me something about the world. And what it taught me was it's not safe. Like, you have to be on hyper alert at all times.
Be careful.
Yeah.
Yeah, be tracking for safety, be tracking for threats. Even if it's not there, even if you didn't have the experience of something, you were just used to, like, looking for it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that I also, so that was my environment. My temperament as a human being is also very sensitive. So those two things combined set me up to be fearful of the world and really easily overwhelmed by the world.
And when you say fearful of the world and overwhelmed by the world, does that translate to saying fearful of people?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
You know how, like, they talk about different classes of anxiety? Like, you could be a person who's anxious about heights. Or you could be a person who's anxious about, like, just the future, sort of preoccupied with planning and being in control. Or you could be a person who just feels anxious and doesn't know why. Yeah, it's just someone who's a little scared, a little hyper alert, kind of scanning for threats a lot. And I think that's the character piece. The other pieces are learned. Maybe
through environment.
But the character is like, sorry.
Do you want a tissue?
The other piece is really that, like, deep core, something's wrong. I don't know what it is, but
you just don't know what it is.
Something is wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, even if it's not something that you can consciously recognize, it sort of rules a lot of the way that you engage with the world.
Exactly.
Because at the core of you, there's something that just doesn't feel quite right about your environment or your place in your environment. And so there is this anxious energy that comes from that. Yeah.
What I would say about the sensitive withdrawn character, though, to answer your question about does that relate to fear of people as well, that for a lot of people it does relate to fear of people. And for me, it's not necessarily a fear of connection, but it's a fear of big crowds. I hate airports.
Being overwhelmed easily. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even taking on too much energy from other people. Like, I think people who are sensitive withdrawn are very energetically sensitive.
Yeah, so it might not even be the kind of situation where if I'm in a crowd of people or I'm in an airport, that I'm worried that someone is going to come up and harm me, or I'm worried that someone's going to come up and steal my luggage, but it's just the sensory overload in and of itself creates that anxiety, and I need to get away from it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. So that's a different way of thinking about safety. It's not really like physical threat necessarily, even though it can be, but it's just that sensory overwhelm.
Yeah, it's kind of feeling like everything out there is not your friend. You know, the sensory, the noise, it's like it all is coming at you and it feels really intense. Yeah.
So I'm curious, how is this different or similar to just being introverted?
That's such a great question. I think they go hand in hand.
Like a lot of introverted people might have this character type, but not necessarily.
Yeah, but not necessarily. Because I think that the biggest thing is that the prime emotion and motivation is fear. So there could be introverts who are really, like, safe in the world.
Right.
They just don't really like being around people that much.
Yep.
And
I put myself in that category.
Yeah. But their motivation for withdrawing is not because they're overwhelmed or tired. It's because that's just where they want to be.
Right. It's just a preference or even a habit.
And I would say that also the spectrum of people in sensitive withdrawn is very wide. So I am speaking just from my experience.
Of course.
I do know a bunch of sensitive withdrawn who are less obviously fearful and just really prefer the company of their own brain.
Right.
The other thing that I would say characterizes sensitive withdrawn is it's someone who tends to escape the world or sensation through their head. So for a therapist, it might be your client who has a really hard time feeling emotions or feeling body sensations and is constantly escaping up into their mind. And if you're watching this and you're just a human who's curious about if this applies to you, it definitely can just be a tendency to daydream, to go into your imagination. And I bet we'll speak about this a little more, but that is one of the positive qualities of someone who's sensitive withdrawn.
Right.
They tend to be very bright, very smart. They tend to have a deeper connection to philosophy and spirituality and creativity. Imagination, because they really have cultivated this whole inner world as a place to withdraw into.
Yeah, as a safe place.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense if your environment is actually so overwhelming or is unsafe. At 0 to 6 months you're old, I mean, what do? You don't have a lot of options to escape your environment, so you kind of retreat into yourself. Feels safer in here than it does out there.
Exactly.
So I'll stay here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how has this particularly showed up for you? I mean, what do you know about your really early life that led to the formation of this character type?
How has it showed up for me in the past or in the present?
Both.
Okay. Well, a great example is when I was a little kid, I had a very active imagination, and that imagination tended to go to very negative places. So, I was very superstitious. Like, I couldn't step on cracks because then my mom would die. I mean, it's funny, but it really ruled.
It felt that way.
It really felt that way, and it bordered on maybe even being OCD-esque, but my mother didn't want to diagnose me. I think she thought it was a phase, which it was.
In like a way of trying to really control how you navigate an unsafe world.
Yes, trying to control my environment and anything negative that could come at me. And I would have, like, here's a prime example. I learned to sleep on my stomach because I thought that if someone came into my room and tried to shoot me, they would think that my body was sideways, but I was actually lying down, so the bullet would go over my back.
Wow.
Which is a wild, I don't know where I came up with that, but I was scared enough about threat that I
Even the way you slept had to be...
That I adjusted the way that I slept.
Wow.
So...
How old were you when you were thinking of that?
Probably early elementary school.
Wow. I mean, that's like formation of right when we start keeping memories.
Yeah, and the context that I would share too is that there's no way that anyone in my life had gotten shot. My mother was very protective over me, so I didn't watch TV or the news. So it wasn't a reality in my outside world.
It was in your imagination.
It was in my imagination.
Yeah, just because you were so oriented to tracking for danger that you would imagine it.
Yes.
Interesting.
So a lot of fear and what I've learned about myself in later years is that my nervous system also has been kind of hyper aroused. I've always had low level anxiety. And I think that maybe has led to more chronic tension and chronic illness later in my life because I was holding myself
Right.
so tightly throughout my early
that's
years.
like the character armor is the term we use in Hakomi, like
Right.
that actually gets translated into how you hold your physical body in terms of prepping for danger, tracking for danger.
Right.
Very like ready to escape or flee or freeze at any time.
Totally.
Yeah.
Very contracted.
Wow.
And so that's a great example of sort of the more negative aspects of the character.
Yeah.
On the flip side, I was an only child, and so I had a lot of time alone, and I became an avid reader, and I had a really wild imaginary life, and I was really creative. My parents always had art supplies around, and we were doing creative things.
Yeah.
And so that was a big part of how I spent my time and how I coped with the world.
Yeah.
And that's been one of the biggest things I love about myself in my adult life.
Beautiful thing. You're a fantastic painter.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So art as a refuge, books as a refuge, the natural world as a refuge. I would just go and play for hours in the woods by myself.
Yeah. It feels very self-sufficient. Like you're able to take care of yourself and enjoy your own company very well, even though you do imagine a lot of danger that might not be there. It feels like you take very good care of yourself.
Yeah. I have a pretty complex relationship inside of me with my inner world.
So what triggers the negative aspects of this character type for you? Like what actually really brings it up where you really like need to retreat into yourself?
Good question. New situations are very hard for me.
Right.
And I think transition and new things is hard for a lot of people for different reasons. But for example, I started a new job a few months ago, going and then coming home and just getting into bed because the stimulation of newness was so much. Wow. Like I just got home and I was exhausted just from being in a new place and meeting new people.
So let's get into the subtleties of that. Like the newness of it, is it just that you're still kind of assessing for threat and danger, and that just takes a lot of energy to constantly be tracking throughout the day? You come home and you'd be tired from it, or something else? Like what was it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me think. I think that it's more like, this is going to seem like a tangent, but when we are just functioning in the world, we're taking in gazillion
bits of information all the time. Yeah.
And what we know about our brains is that we select like 0.002% of that information. And it's to help us because it's so much to filter and process.
Yeah.
And so I think part of what it is for me is that just being in a new place and taking in so much new sensory without having sort of more routine or habit or familiarity is just a lot of stimulation. And my nervous system is activated. So when I don't know where I am, I don't know what to expect, my nervous system gets activated.
Right.
And a telltale piece for people who might be listening to this is sensitive withdrawn character types tend to have a lot of anxiety-related physical expressions. So, for example, I get a stomach ache every time I do something that's scary for me. And I might get headaches frequently, too. So those are some pieces that are
indicative that you're like at your threshold.
At your threshold and maybe in a state of chronic arousal.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So it's really like the sensory overload, the overwhelm of orienting towards a lot of newness. Yeah. And so did you actually find that you would have stomach aches and headaches at your new job?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what are ways that when you were doing that in that situation that helped? Like how did you deal with it in the moment?
I think the biggest thing is I gave myself permission to crash at the end of the night.
Yep.
And I recognized what a big task it was for me. and really made space in my life for it to be the thing that I was doing. Not making social commitments after work, and just really like giving myself space when I could.
Like knowing your limitations there. Knowing this about yourself, you can kind of expect that you're going to need to have a lot of down, quiet time to integrate and slow your system down for a while. Yeah. So in terms of working with people like this, what is it do you feel like you need from either a good friend, your therapist, or even your partner? Like, what are ways that they actually help you with this?
I think one of the biggest things is let me backtrack.
Yeah.
In my personal life, I've been lucky enough to be surrounded with some people who really understand this because they've been there on the inside.
Yeah.
And some people who really don't understand it because it's not their character.
Right.
So for instance, my partner doesn't really draw from this character strategy.
A little bit foreign to him.
Yeah, he feels very safe in the world, which is a beautiful thing. And so I'll have moments of terror, like having a nightmare and feeling terrified by the world, or being really overwhelmed when we're traveling, right? And like just scared.
Yeah, traveling, that's pretty hard.
Yeah, and exciting.
Yeah,
because
it's
it pushes
arousal,
my
right?
edge. Yeah. And so just to have someone who's secure in that way that I'm not, to be there and reassure me and give me a hug and hold me, has really helped my nervous system to retrain.
Yes.
So a lot of what I have worked with and what's been supportive for me is helping to get out of my brain and out of the fear spins and into my body. So that's what a lot of my friends have done over the years that's been so helpful, is helped me to come back to my body, helped me to get out of my thought spirals, and that's what I've done for myself as well. Like, I've really made my relationship with my body a priority. I do yoga, I meditate, I walk in the woods, and I do things that help me to feel grounded and to trust my body in the world, to trust my capacity to get myself where I need to go, to function, and to survive. Because that's basically the fear, is I'm going to die.
I'm going to die.
The world is out to get me.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And it sounds like very restorative things oriented around your body. Did it take you a long time to kind of figure that out?
27 years. I'm still figuring it out. 29 years.
Yeah, still in progress.
Yes.
Yeah, but you're much better at it now, and it sounds like you can even ask for those kinds of things from your partner or from friends in the moment when you're really triggered. You sort of know what you need from people a little bit more than you used to.
Yeah.
What was it like when you just didn't know what you needed or were afraid to ask for it?
Well, that was most of my life. And I had a lot of anxiety most of my life. And what I've learned looking back is that I did a really good job of coping with it the best way I knew how. But to an outsider, the coping wasn't fantastic, Like, I over-exercised because I didn't know why I was exercising, but I knew that it was the only thing that helped me tolerate anxiety. I had an eating disorder, and that was sort of one way that I tried to control my world. And I had relationships that were really wonderful, but where I sort of chronically felt like I wasn't getting enough. But I think in retrospect, it's because I didn't know how to ask for it.
Right, and they didn't necessarily know how to give it.
Right. So I think that's, again, to go back to why character is amazing, is that. It's like once you understand yourself, then you get to make more choices about how you receive support, what type of environment you're in, how you give yourself support. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. How you would want your partner to be treating you.
Yeah.
Yeah. It sounds like a really great lens, too, of actually understanding a lot of the big things that people struggle with, like anxiety, panic attacks, eating disorders, and actually really knowing, like, the genesis of it. Oh, that came out of this character structure because I have this anxious energy. I'm so threatened and overwhelmed by the world around me. I need to be hyper-vigilant and control as much as I possibly can, instead of thinking about it necessarily like in traditional pathological kind of ways.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that answers the first half of your question, which is how do you want your family and friends to treat you? And the second half was how do you want a therapist to treat you?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I guess I'll answer this more from the therapist side, working with a client with this. What I think is really important is that safety is the foremost concern.
Yep.
So not pushing a client past where they want to be.
And being very attuned to knowing where that is.
Yes, and paying attention. So that's both on the therapist and on the client to pay attention to when discomfort or fear starts to come up so that you can handle it in a new way, so that you can practice in the therapy room how to be with that fear or discomfort or desire to withdraw and not do it just out of habit.
Yeah. It sounds like by being very careful with a client like this, it actually shows a lot of respect.
Yeah. Carefulness and slowness.
Yeah.
So that's another thing is for someone who can get really over-aroused and overwhelmed quickly, moving at a really slow, gentle pace is really important.
And focusing on safety.
And I want to say, too, that this applies to people who have these character traits because of trauma they've suffered later in life, too.
Right.
So all these pieces, though the fear might come from different origins, if someone's working with this level of, like,
the world is unsafe,
the same things apply. Safety.
Yeah. Go slow. Don't push people. Yeah. And be very attuned to where those thresholds are.
Yes. Yeah. And I think the thing that Hakomi does so well, curious if you agree with me on this, is that it recognizes that by honoring our boundaries and our limits, we actually create more space to move through them. And that sounds a little convoluted. What I'm trying to say is,
I think I know what you mean.
That when you let someone be the way they are and self-protect the way they need to protect, that protection actually feels seen, feels appreciated, and it can start to relax a little bit over time.
Yes. I can say it a little bit differently.
Great.
I do agree with you. I think that nobody likes to feel judged. No one likes to feel pushed. You know, the vast majority of the time, I think we put on so much of our own pressure on ourselves to be different, to improve, to be the best version of ourselves, that actually feeling that pressure from someone else, there's not a lot of room for it. It doesn't really feel good. And by starting where we are, by acknowledging where we are and really accepting it, it actually gives the space and the energy to mobilize forward, right? And it doesn't feel like a should, it doesn't feel like a pressure, it feels like a more natural, organic movement towards wholeness.
Yeah, because, I mean, these barriers or protections, whatever you want to call them, defense mechanisms in classic language, they actually are really wonderful.
They're there to keep us safe.
They keep us safe, right? Like, supposing that the world is a bad place, and sometimes it is, unfortunately.
It is.
My hypervigilance and my attention to safety is actually really an important thing. And I think part of what good therapy does is it helps you to distinguish when that protection is necessary and helpful, and when it's no longer serving you. It's like when your clothing's a little outdated and it might be time for an upgrade, you know?
Right. Yeah, and that's harder to do a lot of the time because we get so used to being in the world a very particular way. It becomes such a patterned reaction that's habitual that it's hard to stop the momentum. And one of the things that I really like about Hakomi as a therapeutic modality is that instead of heightening or exaggerating what's there, it actually slows down. It slows the system down, it slows the momentum down, and it just studies what's happening in a more mindful place. Yeah, and so that kind of gives people an opportunity to have a little bit more choice about how they want to be in the world.
Yeah, I think that's really the ultimate goal.
That's the ultimate goal.
Choice.
Yeah. So I'm curious, has this come up in any kind of countertransference with you in working with clients? Like, how has this character structure either limited how you show up as a therapist or caused some kind of interpersonal problem with the client if that's arose?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I actually think it's my superpower as a therapist because I'm so sensitive. It's been something that's hard for me in my life, but in this work, it's actually really helped me to be aware and attuned and notice things. Both on a practical and noticing things level and noticing subtlety inside me. But I think the thing that maybe is hardest for me as a therapist and the way that it shows up with countertransference is that I can get easily overwhelmed by intensity depending on what's going on in my personal life. And so I have to work with that. And for instance, if I have a client who's high risk, maybe they're suicidal or their self-harm behaviors or addictions are increasing to a dangerous level,
high risk.
It's very hard for me to not be overly cautious. I'm someone who might even jump the gun with safety, right? Because I'm so conscious of safety. When there's a safety question, I lean heavily towards safety.
Yes. Yeah, so there's a little bit maybe of a bias in that superpower.
Yes.
Of maybe when it's not exactly the right way to go or the necessary thing to do, you might do it anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you said intensity and get easily overwhelmed, what do you mean? Is it like more heated, like hot-blooded intensity, like anger, or will intense sadness do the same thing to you?
I don't think it's any one thing because I don't notice it in the moment. When I'm with a client, I'm just with a client.
Yeah, you'll notice it afterwards.
I'll notice it when I get home and I'm exhausted. And all I did was sit in a chair for 2 hours, right? So it's more on an energetic level. I can take way too much on energetically and find myself thinking about my clients, later that day or the next day or the following week in a way that's not helpful to them or helpful to me, beyond this sort of usual considering a client's case. So, I have to really work with how not to do that. That's kind of my challenge as a therapist.
I'm just going to make sure we're still recording. We are. That makes me feel like, or that makes me think of professional boundaries, right? And it seems like for this character type, there is this safety in being insular in yourself, right? And in therapy, you're really engaging very deeply with somebody else's system, which for a lot of people with this character type could be enough to overwhelm them. It could be enough stimulation just from one person coming at you. And so there is this sort of dance of how do I engage interpersonally in the things that might overwhelm me in a way that feels good and nourishing and won't overwhelm me. This is kind of a trial and error, right?
Yeah, and I think there will always be overwhelm.
Yeah.
Like, I think because that's a theme in my life, it will keep showing up in my professional life, in my personal life.
Yeah.
And what I aim for, rather than like getting rid of it completely, is learning how to titrate it. So,
I love that.
So how to like have some exposure and then have some safety, challenge and safety, and going back and forth between the two of those. Kind of like to picture myself like a turtle sometimes, you know, like I'll go out, do my stuff, and then I'll go back into my safe place, you know, whether that's a literal safe place or my mind. Yeah.
Yeah. That made me think of something I wanted to ask you about, but I lost it there.
Take your time.
Yeah. What really strikes me about that is that there is this kind of knowing that this character type is a superpower for you, especially in therapy, and I'm sure in a lot of other ways in your life. And even though there are ways that it holds you back, and ways that it kind of might influence you negatively, we're not trying to get rid of it, right?
Right.
Like, there is just some aspect of accepting that this is who you are in this lifetime. This is how you're going to be navigating the world. And even though it might hold you back in a lot of ways, you kind of have to learn how to love it.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think that you nailed it. On that one.
Yeah, and that's always, of course, easier said than done.
Right.
I'm trying to think if there's something else.
Take time, look at your list.
Oh, right, the list. Yeah, here's something I can ask you. In terms of nourishment barriers, that's something I haven't really talked about in other videos or blogs yet, and I will. But with this character type, what's in this concept?
Great.
What nourishment is being kept at bay here?
Well, a lot of things. For me personally, it's rest. You know, that might sound paradoxical because I spend so much time by myself, but it's hard to like settle into myself. Like, it's hard for me to get not hyper aroused and not be anxious and be like calm and embodied and present. Yeah, and that makes it more difficult being kind of industrious too. Totally, yeah. Taking on more than you can handle. Yeah. Yeah, so that sort of deep level of rest and peace is hard for me to find. And something actually that I wanted to say is that I've even though I've had a lot of anxiety in my life, I've also had periods of intense depression. And what I understand now is that that depression was kind of my way of coping with being anxious in the world, right? Interesting. Because my body has a really hard time resting. Yeah. And depression is kind of like enforced rest. It's forced it, yeah. So there are ways that going all the way into depression actually gave my body an opportunity to have a break. It feels like it's your body almost trying to balance itself. Exactly. Like, if you're living up here all the time and you have difficulty getting here, it'll go down here. Exactly. Just so you can come back up at some point. Yes. Yeah. So, yeah, I think that nourishment has been really hard for me to get, and it's played into health problems that I have. Yeah. And I guess the other thing I would say is that I think it's harder to take risks. The newness of something. I do anyways, but Yeah, the unknown feels scary.
Mm-hmm.
So it takes a lot of courage, maybe more than it would for other people, to face the unknown, to go through big life transitions. Because there's not an automatic assumption that it's going to turn out okay.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually an automatic assumption that it's not going to turn out okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right. So would you say, generally speaking, that people with this character type usually don't do quote-unquote riskier behaviors or riskier lifestyles, even like super active things like rock climbing or skydiving or something like that?
Well, I don't know. That's a great question, and I'd want to survey more people, because I think it could be that happens, or it could be the opposite, where they become addicted to pushing themselves out of this feeling of fear or anxiety. Right?
Mm-hmm. Especially if they're fighting against how they naturally are. They don't really like that they're this way.
Yeah.
So they sort of force being different. Hence the acceptance thing that we were talking about earlier. Yeah, that can be really difficult for people if they are experiencing just a level of anxiety throughout their life all the time and have maybe, similar to you, these swings into depression to kind of rebalance, that it actually creates a lot of unpleasant tone in their life. They have this judgment about it, like, why am I always anxious? I hate this. Make this go away. And it sounds like that just kind of makes it worse.
Well, I think it does.
Yeah.
But that's just my personal experience. Right?
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
This is very cool stuff. Yeah.
It's very cool. I think the last thing that I want to say, too, that I've been sort of noticing in my own life is that character, like we said, is part temperament, part environment. And the environment that we're in is, there's so many different pieces of that. It's like family, it's culture, it's religion, it's ethnic background, it's what school you went to, who your first grade teacher was. There's so many pieces. And one of the pieces I've been really fascinated with is family lineage. And so if you believe in intergenerational trauma, or like things being passed through bloodlines or family culture systems, I think this is, for me, comes from my family as well. So it's partly my own stuff that I've experienced and accumulated over my lifetime, and partly the lineage that I'm from, which is the Jewish lineage. So, you know, like when you come from a culture of people who have been oppressed and unsafe in the world, like it makes sense that there will be a message somewhere in your family system, somewhere in your blood, that it's not safe, right? And so
that I can't be who I am in the world if I'm open and honest with who I am, how I think and feel about things. People are going to harm me, judge me, ostracize me, kill me. Yeah.
So yeah, it's a learned behavior again that might be really functional at one point, and now by my generation is a little outdated, right? So again, it's this question of like, how can I honor the gifts that this character has brought and the reasons that it might exist in my life, and how can I make some choices to find freedom from it as well?
Yes. Yeah, what parts of this continue to serve me? What parts of this do I like? And the parts that I don't like, how can I work with them in a way where I'm slowly changing them without resenting them? Where I can still kind of accept them and feel some aspect of self-compassion and move forward differently. Yeah, that's interesting that you even brought up the intergenerational cultural messages type stuff, because I feel very similar about the Jewish lineage in terms of being self-reliant as well. And that's a whole different thing, I know, but it is this sort of, I can't really depend on anyone else. I really have to do it myself. I'm not expecting support or help or nurturance from my environment. And so I'm going to be really hyper vigilant to just like do what I do it well, be productive, take care of myself, and I'm very good at it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which I feel is, kind of a Jewish thing too.
Yeah. No, I'll just sit in the dark.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that's coming to your mind? I think
no.
that's
I
super
feel like
thorough.
that pretty much wraps it up. I mean, there's so much more to say.
Yeah.
And the last thing I will say is that it's great to be able to share my experience because I feel like I really do live this character.
Yeah.
But I know a lot of people who have this same character type and look really different.
Totally.
From the outside, and their internal experience is really different. So if you're watching this and you don't feel like you relate to what I've said, it doesn't mean that you don't have aspects of this character too.
Yeah, it's important to say that we all have aspects of every one of the character strategies, even though we predominantly use one or two.
Right.
And then, of course, there's all these other variables along religious lines, gender lines, family culture, and heritage lines, where this will show up vastly, vastly differently. Yeah. And it's like it's a map and it's not the territory.
Yeah.
Very useful for understanding yourself and moving forward in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And also, it's limiting. It's just a map. It's not religion.
Yeah. Cool.
Thanks, Valerie. I appreciate it.
Yeah.